Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptation. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are breaking down episode 2 of Heated Rivalry, titled Olympians. In this episode, we're going to go scene by scene and look closely at the moments that define this particular chapter of Shane and Ilya's story and break down why they matter so much, because so many of the little moments in this episode lead to very big payoffs by the finale. We will be looking into the subtext, a lot of the unsaid emotions and feelings that Rachel Reid so beautifully layers into the original book. And most importantly, we will be tackling the ending of the episode in Shane's point of view, and then there will be a bonus episode of Ilya's point of view. That added context completely reframes the moment that they share and reveals a lot of emotional depth and intention that Shane and the reader are not fully aware of at the time. So today we're going to break down what's on screen, what's on the page, and take a good close look at Shane and Ilya's relationship in episode 2, Olympians. The opening montage in episode 2 of Heated Rivalry is done so well, but it's also very complex. The entire first episode is all of part 1 in the books, and part 2 actually starts in December 2013. The show uses this to span the time between summer 2011 and spring 2013. The Vegas rooftop scene in the last episode takes place in June 2011, and we can see now that it's the summer of 2011 when the montage begins. It also serves as a way to show us that the two of them have been communicating via text but have not been seeing each other in person. One of the key differences here is that in the book, February 2011 in Montreal is the first time that Shane and Ilya actually sleep together, and that's when we have the come here, no you come here scene. In the show version, the two of them are around one another but have not been hooking up, or at least it's implied that they have not been. We can see multiple seasons passing between the two of them and how their careers are playing out on Boston and Montreal respectively, and that through all of that, Ilya has maintained communication with Shane and keeps trying to meet up with him again. But Shane is resistant to that. To me, the choice to do this is probably for a multitude of reasons. The first is that it shows that Ilya has a greater investment than just physical. The book actually doesn't cover anything that happens in winter 2012, spring 2012, fall 2012. The next time we see them is in December of 2013. So all of these scenes that we're seeing on screen here are filler that were made up and written for the TV show only. It's also a great way to show us as viewers more of their dynamic via text, how Ilya communicates with Shane, how his English is improving over the course of this time, how they're growing up, because in 2011 they would be 20 years old. In terms of how these scenes are shot, I actually love how they use the text messages here. They keep them all on one side of the screen, and for the most part, Shane is always on the left and Ilya is almost always on the right, and that is kept consistent through all of the text message interactions that we see. The other thing that this montage conveys is that over time, both of them are on their phones more often, and something that gets expanded upon more in the montage in episode 4. It's clear they're longing to hear from the other person. They're also using these montages to create more visual cues that will pay off later in the season, like Shane having his drawstring in his mouth, and then the next scene showing Ilya with his chain in his mouth. We saw them do that in the stands in episode 1 of the series. We also see that show up later in the episodes. The other thing these text messages convey is that Shane often wants to say something and backtracks on it. He deletes messages a lot or starts typing and then stops typing. And again, that's foreshadowing to a few times in later episodes where we see him do the same thing. He's still not confident about where he stands with Ilya and what he can or should say. The last thing that I think this montage conveys is that throughout the years, they are always thinking about each other, and that doesn't ever stop. One thing that the overarching storyline is trying to show us is that these people, no matter how hard they try, are drawn to each other like moths to a flame. Eventually it will come to a head, and they're going to have to admit to each other that this pull they feel for one another can't be denied inside them. There's a reason they keep going back to each other and can't stop. In the book, by the time we get to December of 2013, the scene is in Ilya's point of view, and they are on the plane flying to Montreal to play Shane's team. Ilya's actually on the plane with his new teammate, Ryan Price, who we get a name drop for in episode 4. While on that flight, he's trying to distract himself by watching a movie with Ryan, and admits that it's because playing Montreal puts him on edge, and if it's not nerves, it's something else. Anticipation, but he doesn't want to admit or say that it's actually excitement to see Shane. Ilya and Shane had hooked up last October during the home opener, and at that time, Ilya had booked a hotel room down the street from where Montreal was staying in Boston, and Shane had showed up really angry because they lost, and Ilya was thinking about that on the plane flying to Montreal. He admits that the thing that's going on with Shane makes him feel disgusted with himself. And by the time the plane lands, that is when we drop into the beginning of episode 2. We are in the locker room with Shane and his teammates, and much of this dialogue is pretty close to how it is in the source material. The main difference is that this line that JJ delivers to Shane, which kind of throws him off, is different in the books than it is in the show. In the books, JJ says, "I'm telling you right now, if Rosanov starts shit with you tonight, I'm taking him out." And then the team starts collectively talking about Ryan Price being the real threat because he's an instigator. In the show, it's almost a way to showcase Shane's internalized homophobia, and also that he's constantly in fear of being discovered. In the books, Shane describes the anticipation whenever they play Boston as every cell in his body being sparked with a need to get out on the ice and face Rosanov, and then when the games are over, it pulsed with a different kind of need. In this moment with Hayden, where they're talking about the interviews that Shane has to give, Shane is kind of reluctant to have to speak with the media because they ask pretty dumb questions game after game. And even though it's tedious for him and he doesn't necessarily love having to do the interviews, he knows that there are kids who are watching, and he remembers being a kid himself and loving seeing his favorite stars being interviewed after the games. This also feeds into the notion that Shane is very much trying to fit the mold of a perfect hockey player, whereas Ilya does not. Shane always tries to say the right things and fit into the mold of team first, whereas Ilya kind of always is rubbing up against that standard and that norm of what a hockey player should be like. When he's back in the locker room in the book, he goes to send a text message to his parents because he talks to them before every game, but he ends up finding a text message from Ilya instead. This is when their norms start to shift because Ilya never texts him before the games. They don't talk to each other before games, and especially not in this very suggestive way. When Shane answers him, I don't know, twice maybe, Ilya finds that funny because he thinks that Shane is so pure and honest and sweet, and he always finds that very endearing about him. I love that in the opening montage, they've established that Shane isn't quite sure how to talk to Ilya, so he writes things and deletes them before sending them. It's a great way of showcasing how much internal conflict Shane is having about their conversation. And it's also a really great narrative device that they use time and time again, especially when we see it again at the very end of this episode. Ilya's smile in this scene is so perfect because it captures just how much Shane's humor means to him. And in the book, Ilya chooses to say your mom because he knows that Shane loves his mom and that it would bother him, even though he knows it's a stupid comment to make. This is also one of the early examples of how Ilya is constantly trying to cross the line with Shane to see just how far he can go with his commentary, things he says, things he implies. Because Shane's very straight-laced, and Ilya is constantly trying to find that kind of danger zone for them to cross over into. He finds it fun to tease Shane, and he spends this whole text interaction imagining Shane in the Montreal dressing room blushing and shoving his phone into a bag or something so that none of his teammates would see what they were talking about. And Ilya says he hopes that Shane's mad about it later when they meet up after the game, because Ilya feeds off of Shane's anger, and not in a way that I think he is being purposefully mean to Shane, but Shane is only expressive when he's angry. It's the easiest point of entry for Ilya to get Shane to kind of cross the line with him. I also love the addition of this scene where we are in Ilya's locker room. We see him with Cliff Marlowe, and we get this brilliant line about, this girl always works you up, Ilya, and he's, I don't blush. Russians do not do this. It's a perfect moment of levity before we see that the game ends and Shane's team wins. So there's already a lot of anticipation before they meet at Shane's house. This scene when Ilya goes to Shane's house for the first time in the show plays out very differently in the source material. And that's for a few reasons. In the books, this takes place in February of 2011 when both of them are 20 years old. In the show, this is taking place in 2013. In the books, Shane does not want Ilya coming to his home because he feels like that's way too big of a line for them to cross. So when Ilya tries to get his address, Shane does not give it to him and actually books a hotel room. I really love the addition of this scene here where they are competing with one another running up the stairs, because not only is it fun and playful and cute, but it reminds us that these two men are very competitive with each other and in general. I also enjoyed the inclusion of this real estate joke that runs through the series between Shane and Ilya. In the books, Shane actually owns a building that has multiple units in it, and that is where he and Ilya go to hook up because he does not want Ilya going to his home. He very much tries to keep his experiences with Ilya separate from his personal life. In the show, Shane does allow Ilya into his home. This line of Mr. Real Estate, Mr. Landlord is a really great narrative callback that they use a few times throughout the series. Shane also overshares here, which is meant to showcase his nerves. Visually speaking, this shot is so beautiful because it's used in the season finale as a visual callback where Shane's face is in frame and we can see him reacting to Ilya walking towards him. In the book, when Ilya is approaching Shane, he has a thought of not remembering why exactly he thought this was a bad idea. And that's something that happens every time the two of them get together. Because the show chooses to have this take place in Shane's actual home, we get to see Shane's bedroom. This is a big deal in the books because Ilya spends most of their relationship never seeing Shane's actual bedroom. And by the time he gets to the cottage, he realizes that his bedroom there is actually more personal than the one in Montreal. The fact that Shane admits he had a designer come in here is meant to imply that this room is very impersonal. This might be one of my favorite shots of the series where we see Ilya be the most vulnerable. We get a narrative callback with the smoking line, how Shane nags Ilya for smoking cigarettes. That's going to pay off later when Ilya stops smoking for Shane. His face in this scene is the most open we've seen so far in the series. And when he says, "Come here, no, you come here," that is taken from the books. To me, this is the first moment where their dynamic cracks and it seems like they're actually having fun. It's not as high stakes or stressful. It's enjoyable. We see Shane smile more in this scene leading up to their first time together. And we also have this scene be used as a vehicle to share just how attentive and kind Ilya can be, because he spends the entire time asking for permission and consent and being very conscientious. And beneath his hard exterior, he is actually very emotionally intelligent and intuitive for Shane. Because in the book, Shane is terrified and you're in his head the whole time and he keeps thinking to himself how scared he is. In the book, Shane describes feeling happier than he should be and wondering how the hell he was ever going to experience that feeling again. I do love the show's choice to include this forehead kiss here because it encapsulates how afraid both of them are to be vulnerable. They just did the most vulnerable thing you can do with another person, but as soon as it seems like it could be feelings involved, they freak out. When Ilya kind of denies this moment of tenderness and vulnerability, Shane has a thought of course he's going to leave. Why did I think that anything else would happen? In the book timeline, the next scene is the Las Vegas scene. But in the show, we get this really beautiful scene between them in the back staircase. There is another scene in the book that kind of blends with how they shot this one in the show, which is when he actually brings Ilya to the abandoned building that he bought, and right after the locker room texting moment. So the show kind of moves things around and combines things together. And the book refers to that scene because that's where the line Ilya says to Shane about getting him off hands-free comes from. And in that scene, we're in Ilya's POV, and he says that it felt different with Hollander. It's also where he says, "I'm dead, you killed me." In the books, when Shane brings up Russia and the Olympics, Ilya is excited, but he's thinking about the expectations of his home country, his father, and all of that makes his stomach hurt and makes him want to have a cigarette. The line about winning a bronze medal is also taken from the source material. What I love about this scene, though, is that it wasn't actually planned to be shot like this. And what I mean by that is that the kiss that Shane and Ilya share on the staircase here is far more tender than it was meant to be shot. And Jacob Tierney has said in multiple interviews that they weren't sure that they were going to be able to use it because a lot of people who were working on the project thought that it was too early on in the timeline for them to have a moment that was this sweet. But to me, this scene makes the show. If this kiss isn't shot this way, I don't know if everything later on hits as heavily. In the book, Ilya is the one that leans down and kisses Hollander quickly on the mouth. The show, it lingers longer, and then we zero in on Shane's face reacting to it, and you can see just how happy he is. And in the book, Ilya grins like an idiot for his entire cab ride home. The Winter Olympics in Russia is a really important timestamp for the show and in Shane and Ilya's relationship. And I really like that in a few quick scenes, we get a lot of added context and move the needle in their relationship in a very significant way. When we first find Shane here, he's sitting alone at a cafe and looking through old text messages with Ilya on his phone because he just found out that Ilya and Russia had lost in the tournament, and it is unacceptable. It was a huge upset, and Ilya is obviously very flustered by this because there's a lot of implications to that loss. While Shane is sitting at this cafe looking at his phone, we actually get a timestamp that the date is February 13th, 2014. And on his phone, a message pops up from his mom that says, "Is everything okay? Don't forget to wear your Reeboks," which is a callback to episode 1 and his brand deal with Reebok. He chooses not to answer his mom and then compose a text message to Ilya saying, "Hey, you doing okay?" to ask how he's faring with the loss that they just experienced. In the book, the text message that Shane actually sends to Ilya says, "Having a good time?" ? So I was really glad to see that in the show, they chose to have Shane ask a question that is more based on how Ilya is feeling, because clearly Ilya would not be having a good time after losing. The actual chapter in the book starts with Shane's name being called by Carter Vaughn and Scott Hunter, who both play for the New York Admirals. And it is one of the few times we see Shane alone because his parents did not travel to the tournament. In the books, he's been thinking about Ilya often since he arrived in Russia, so this sitting at the table and the text message is meant to convey that. When Shane is interacting with Scott and Carter, in the books, he makes a note that Scott was like an angel who was really good at playing hockey, and he looked like an angel. He's described as having blonde hair and blue eyes and being built like a Navy SEAL, who was also a model, who also maybe was a firefighter, which is funny because it's one of the few times that we kind of observe Shane finding another man attractive. They really don't touch on that a lot in the show. He also observes Carter in this scene and notes that he is also attractive. So it's kind of a slow way that the book version is sharing with us that Shane is noticing men. In the books, they also discuss the accommodations, they make jokes about who their roommates are, and then they ask what the plans are for the night, and Shane brings up speed skating. Scott is actually the one that brings up the men's figure skating short program being on that night too. I love this shot because it will be used in a visual callback in episode 3 when we start the beginning of Scott's storyline, and this kind of slow push from the camera in on Shane in this episode changes to a slow camera pan in on Scott in episode 3. Carter saying that the men's figure skating competitors are brave plays out very similar in the books. Here they just make a point to focus on Scott Hunter's face, because if you hadn't read the books, you wouldn't know that he is also hiding the fact that he is gay. And in the book, there is a mention of Carter saying the guys are brave as hell, and Scott says right, then turns to look out at the ocean. In the book, Shane is aware about the laws against homosexuality, and he tried to not think about it too much when enjoying the Olympics. But there is a moment in the book where he says he was thinking about Ilya and thought, Ilya can take care of himself. This was his home. He would know how to keep himself safe. After this interaction is when Shane thinks to himself in the book that he should reach out to Ilya or text him, and he desperately wants to make contact with him, but he doesn't know where to find him. That's the moment when he actually texts Ilya having a good time. He meant it to be very cool and casual and friendly, but the undertone was, hey, we're both at the Olympics, are you in jail? And he waited all night for Ilya to reply, but he never got one. At that point in the books, the point of view switches to Ilya, and it's the scene that takes place between him and his father. The show rearranges it, so instead it's Shane and Carter and Scott at the men's figure skating and Shane spotting Ilya in the stands. Ilya would have received the text message from Shane when he was with his father, so it was not a good time for him to read it, which is a big reason why he chose not to answer him. He also felt like it was really dangerous for Shane to make contact with him. In the books, Shane actually spots Ilya during the Sweden-Finland hockey game, not during the figure skating. And just like in the show, when Shane approaches him, Ilya says, not here. All of the delivery of this is pretty true to the books, where Ilya is purposefully short. The inclusion of this text message from Alexei is meant to foreshadow the moment that comes after, when we see Ilya having to deal with the aftermath of the loss and the anger of his father. And this shot is really meant to showcase that he feels very alone in Sochi. When Shane walks up to Ilya, he notices that Ilya looks exhausted and he has dark rings under his eyes. He's very pale, but there's an alarming change in his eyes. And normally Ilya has a playful kind of spark in his eyes, but it looked like it had been completely extinguished. Before Shane even says anything of substance, Ilya's trying to get him to leave him alone. And Shane notes that it's the first time he's ever really seen Ilya look uncomfortable. Shane asks, are you okay, in the book and the show? And he said it really, really quietly, but Ilya says, please go. That's when Shane starts to take it personally. And he says, you didn't answer my text. And suddenly, Shane realizes that that sentence might sound really dumb. But in actuality, he was worried that he might be in jail or, at the worst, sad, which is obviously true because Ilya is sad. So when Ilya says, no, I didn't answer your boring text, now will you go? Shane's wounded by that because Ilya is being mean, which isn't new, but he can tell that he doesn't mean it. And in that moment, all Shane really wants is for Ilya to ask him to stay, because Ilya looks like he needs a hug, and Shane can tell that something's really off and bothering him. But he knows that this is not the environment where that could ever happen, and he also knows that that's not really the dynamic between them. So in his head, he kind of distracts himself by saying, yeah, I can't be worried about Ilya anyway. Canada's playing in the quarterfinals. We need to focus on that. So when he walks away and leaves Ilya alone, you feel that palpable missed opportunity for connection between them. And in the books, by the time Shane gets to his seat, Ilya had left the rink. Importantly, in the book, the last paragraph of the chapter, Shane is reflecting on what has happened for Ilya during the tournament, meaning that they are in Russia and Russia has already been kicked out of the tournament. And he knows that that must feel awful because the team had been terrible. And it's not Ilya's fault. And Shane knows that, but he also knows that if he were in that same position, he would be beating himself up about it relentlessly. And if it was his team that had lost that way on home turf, he would also be really upset. So Shane is very understanding in this scene and actually really brave to try and reach out and make connection with him. And just the fact that Shane approached Ilya must go a really long way. So it's a really important moment for them. This scene between Ilya and his father is one of my absolute favorites from the series, but there's so much context in the books that help aid us understanding what is going through Ilya's head here. In the book, Ilya is required to attend a gala tonight, which was mainly a chance for the government to show off to foreign dignitaries. And it was exactly the type of event Ilya historically didn't want to attend, and he finds himself wishing that he could just go home, and it's the first time he starts thinking of Boston as his home. This whole week, Ilya's father had only spoken to him to tell him how badly he had let his country down, but then that evening he would be parading him around as though he was proud of him. He wanted to refuse to go to his father's hotel room, and he wasn't strong enough, and he gets there 5 minutes early, because if he wasn't 5 minutes early, then he was late. This is a great time for the show to inform the viewer of his father's illness. So they include a bunch of shots where we see how hard he is on Ilya, but also that he's forgetting things. In the books, Ilya also notes that his father was almost 50 years older than him, which is important because we learn of his parents' age gap later on in the books. In this scene, Ilya is waiting for his father to find something wrong with him, and in the book, he made sure that everything about his suit, his hair was impeccable, but he knew his father would always find something to belittle him about. He mentions his haircut, but we also see how he starts critiquing how he played. Much of this dialogue is direct from the books, including the line of, "It's a shame you had such promise when you were young." And in the story, Ilya thinks to himself, "I'm only 22. I'm one of the best hockey players in the world." Instead, he says, "I'm a better player now than I have ever been. The team just hasn't been working well together." When his father blames their play on him, Ilya thinks to himself, what about the coach? As soon as his dad starts to critique his tie and asks, "Did your mother do this? She doesn't know how to do this properly," Ilya freezes, and his father tries to play it off, which we do see in the way they shot this, a very accurate depiction of that. I think the line of always looking for someone else to blame is a great addition to the dialogue, and reminding us that his father has felt this way about him since he was a child. When you know that Ilya's mother died when he was 12 and that he found her, and how he had no emotional support through that very intense time, I think this is the first time in the show that we really get to peel back a layer on Ilya's character and see what's going on beneath the surface, and it helps to place why he behaves the way he does. His father would have shaped his fight or flight responses. His father would have shaped his self-esteem, and it's easy to understand why Ilya turned to hockey as a way for him to escape and get away from this very toxic environment that he grew up in. Ilya in the book notes that he doesn't like his father, but it's really painful for him to watch him deteriorate. And he thinks to himself that it might actually be easier when his father's brain is gone because he might not be as cruel. But every time Ilya starts to feel bad for him, his father says something so cutting that it makes it hard for him to feel sorry. I've touched on this already in other scene breakdowns, but I also think that this is a really clear way that the show is showcasing Ilya's behavior and where it stems from, in that this part of his life, which is basically everything outside of hockey, he has no control over. And the way that he coped with that is through his sexual encounters with partners and people, because that's where he could find control. It makes sense then that when he's with Shane, he naturally falls into that more control-based, territorial, or dominant role, because it's one of the few places where he feels like he has control over anything. But the ultimate irony for him is that Shane makes him simultaneously feel out of control because he cannot control his emotions for him. In the books, this is the moment when Ilya would have received the text message having a good time, and it's no wonder that Ilya ignores it. I absolutely love this scene, and I've broken it down in a different capacity before, mainly talking about how Connor's story does such an incredible job conveying his disassociation. He deadens his eyes to the point where you can tell that nobody is home inside of his body. His dad and the minister are having a conversation about him, and he is not partaking at all. This is also important because Svetlana's dad is the minister, and we also know that Svetlana's dad was a Russian goaltender. That is a change from the books that's pretty important, because Svetlana is a childhood friend in the show, and in the books she is not. She's just a hookup. In this slow pan, we can see that his father continues to berate him. And what's really clever about this scene is that they reinforce to us that Svetlana is a very important person in his life by having her be the one that theoretically saves him from this conversation. By having her be observant enough to come over and disrupt this conversation and remove Ilya from the conversation itself, puts her in a position of power in his life. And what I mean by that is she is the only person that's looking out for him in any capacity, and the only person, as we come to find out, that Ilya knows how to have feelings around. I really loved this book change, that they made them childhood friends, and that they also made Svetlana so much more important in Ilya's personality and personal life, because ultimately she acts like his version of Rose. She encourages him to admit to himself he has feelings for Shane, even though she doesn't know it's Shane necessarily, and not shy away from them. And we see more of that play out and get a better idea of her as a character in the scene that follows this. This entire scene is a scene that was added to the show and not taken out of the books, and it's actually a really beautiful and important one. So even though normally I'm breaking down a scene and comparing it to the source material, I think that this scene is successful in a lot of ways to establish things that are kind of unspoken in the source material. We have already been introduced to Svetlana, and in this scene we are introduced to another person in Ilya's life whose name is Sasha, and he, through context clues like this one, is the coach's son who Ilya told Shane about in episode 1. This scene also does a great job of establishing just how intelligent and knowledgeable about hockey Svetlana is, which is a really cool change from the books. They made her really dynamic in this scene, and you can tell that she is a student of hockey. In terms of visuals, I love how this scene is shot because they use the mirrors so effectively here. So even when the camera is focusing on whoever's speaking, like Svetlana, you can still see Ilya or Svetlana transversely in the background while they're talking, which is important because their body language does kind of incite things over the course of this conversation. Svetlana's explaining to Ilya that he has every opportunity to win the cup here, and she maps out exactly how that would come to pass, which is something that a student of hockey would observe and think about very objectively. I already made a video talking about what I hope they do with Svetlana in season 2, because I think her being such a student of hockey would make her an unbelievable agent or scout or member of management for a team. And what's brilliant is that in the scene that follows this, we can tell that everything she's predicting in this moment comes true. Inserting a scene like this where we get to see Ilya interacting with someone other than Shane or his teammates, I think is really important because it makes him feel like a fully fleshed out character. And this scene does serve more than one purpose. First of all, we get to see more of Svetlana introduce her hockey smarts and her hockey knowledge and her hockey sense, which as a hockey player myself was so refreshing to see on screen. It also doubles down on the fact that she has a very significant role in Ilya's life moving forward because she's very invested in his career. She watches like a student of the game, and they make her a really well-rounded character in this show, which I appreciate so deeply. The other reason this scene is really important to moving the needle of the show along is we get to see more of Ilya's dynamic with Sasha and what it represents narratively. In the books, Ilya mentions in his thoughts quite often that he really likes danger, and that love of danger stems from his very complicated relationship with his father and his family, something that I touched on in the video before this where I broke down the conversation between Ilya and his dad in the hotel room before the gala. When Ilya was growing up, he used sex as a way to control things in his life and escape. And in the book, some of those examples are his coach's son, which is Sasha, his brother's girlfriend, which again would incite why Alexei hates Ilya so much, or would be one of the many reasons. He also mentions his teammate's sister, so naturally you would understand why he would have initially been lured to Shane, because he was the worst idea in every way imaginable. Because the scene before this, we had witnessed Ilya's interaction with his father and learned about how toxic of a dynamic the two of them share, we're kind of primed to understand the headspace that Ilya would be in this situation. Keep in mind, he also would have received the text message from Shane during that conversation with his father, and he's in Russia. So if you think about Ilya dealing with his father, his family dynamics, losing in the tournament in Russia on home soil and being a failure, and then Shane uncharacteristically reaching out to him and in the show saying something nice, his head would be absolutely reeling at this point. So historically, Sasha approaching him might have been a welcomed escape for him, but he's slowly starting to understand that Shane cares for him, and he doesn't have people in his life other than Svetlana that care for him. This whole conversation where Sasha is trying to revert Ilya back to the way he was when he was younger not only shows us that Ilya has grown up and his wants and needs might have changed, but I think it's also a smart narrative device to show that his interests are changing too. I love the visual here in the mirror that we can see Ilya pushing Sasha away from him in the reflection, and he maintains this very uninterested look on his face throughout this interaction, which Ilya in the books is constantly masking. The difference between him and Shane is that Shane very much has a glass face. He thinks he's hiding what he's feeling, but it's written all over his face. Ilya has perfected this, hiding his feelings, because he had to. He spent his entire childhood being hyper aware of his father's anger and figuring out any way that he could dodge and avoid it so that he wouldn't get in trouble or worse. There's a passage in the book that I thought of when I was watching this scene, which is that Ilya realizes that he feels good when he's with Shane. And he doesn't want to admit to himself that things are necessarily better with him than with anybody else, but he acknowledges that it's different with Shane. And to me, I think the fact that Shane cares is what is different for Ilya. He's not used to someone caring because he won't let them. He puts up a wall, and he puts up a wall until 2014. In the book, we don't read about Shane watching Ilya win the Stanley Cup with his team. This is a scene that was added into the show, but I really love it because it gives a lot more weight to the scenes that follow it when they are at the awards. It also allows us to clue into more of Shane's idiosyncrasies and how awkward he can be with other people, like bringing a bottle of wine even though he doesn't know anything about wine, doesn't drink wine. And also we can see that Jackie, Hayden's wife, has ginger ale for him ready to go in the fridge. When we walk into Hayden's home, we can see Shane's teammates in here. And just like Svetlana predicted, they got beat up in the playoffs. JJ has a sling on his arm. Their goalie has a boot on and is in a wheelchair. There's also a really great continuity going on here because they're shaving his playoff beard, which historically, and they mentioned this at the beginning, you only have for the playoffs, and they are no longer in the playoffs. As someone who lives near Boston, I loved this little montage of shots of the duck boats. And we're watching kind of a highlight reel of Ilya and how he's been playing throughout the playoffs on a tear since the loss in the Olympics. Here's the continuity though. They've shaved his beard in this scene. And I like all these hockey montages. I think they did a really good job with the people they hired to be the stand-ins here. Ilya's speech in the locker room made me laugh as a hockey player because him starting it off by talking about himself would never happen. But it kind of leans into something I've been saying in a number of my review videos, which is that Ilya is a very unconventional hockey player. Hockey culture very much reinforces that everything is about the team and never about the individual. For him to be a captain and talk about himself in any capacity would have been something that a lot of people shunned. And Shane, we see multiple times directly feeding into the hockey culture and abiding by it very closely. Over the course of this speech, though, he kind of won me back over because he starts talking about wanting to win in their own building in front of their own fans, which is all very true. The playoffs are a grind, and by the end of it, to win in front of your own fans is the ultimate way to win. I also kind of thought it was funny that he says he wants to F San Francisco, and it reminded me of JJ mixing up his words at the beginning of the episode. Ultimately, though, when he says, "I've seen you all do it, I know we can do it," that's when his leadership starts to come through in this speech. But I think the ultimate thing they're trying to convey here is that Ilya is angry. He's been angry since Sochi, and he's been channeling that anger into every single game that they've played. And that gets reinforced with a lot of the voiceover commentary from the press and the people who are covering the game. I thought it was also pretty funny that when he's finished with his speech, Cliff comes up to him and says, "Great effing speech." And Ilya just says, "Go F yourself." A lot of F-bombs being thrown around, which is also very common in hockey culture. This slow pan where we get to see Shane sitting on the couch with all of his teammates is one of my favorites in the whole show. We can also see all of the injuries on the couch, and Hayden has 2 black eyes. So again, Svetlana predicted correctly that Montreal was never going to win the cup. They had too many injuries. They were far too banged up. The guys in the room are all talking about Ilya, and Shane admits that he's very good here, and his teammates defend him and say, "No, you're the best, actually." But Shane, in his heart and in this book, truly does think that Ilya is the better hockey player. He won't admit it out loud, but he will admit it to himself. And Hudson Williams deserves all the credit in the world for this shot in particular, because the world is moving on around him. Life goes on. The game didn't mean anything for these guys because they were already knocked out. But Shane is having so many emotions flood through him watching Ilya win the cup. And the little tiny smirk of pride that he gives for him is so important. In the book, Shane says that he's sick with jealousy, but undeniably proud when he watched Ilya lift the cup over his head. And in the show, we see him scream, "For you, Mom," in Russian as well. That raw emotion that Ilya is displaying is what makes Shane tear up. And Shane identifies that it's as though he was saying, "F you, I did it, F you" to someone, which we know it's his father. They have not spoken for 6 months, and that is when we get the Vegas bathroom scene, which I've broken down from both Shane and Ilya's point of view. In the book Heated Rivalry, we are in Shane's POV, even though it's told in third person. Shane has not talked to Ilya in 6 months, and he thinks that it's silence that he deserved. Shane thinks that it has to do with Ilya losing the Olympics in Russia. When Ilya approaches him, he's actually recalling a moment before when they had been talking in a hotel room together, and he pulls on his collar because he's flushed from that memory. He's not uncomfortable in the suit. He's remembering that room and everything that they didn't say. When Ilya shows up late, Shane's first thought isn't anger, it's that he looks good, which makes Shane immediately mad at himself. Because for Shane, screw him. You didn't text me for 5 months with no explanation, and now you're going to walk in here looking like a European supermodel and acting like nothing's changed. It makes Shane flustered and frustrated and painfully aware that nothing has ever really changed between them yet. So at the podium, Shane doesn't have to pretend to hate Ilya. When Ilya puts his arm around Shane's shoulders, Shane notices everything. He recalls that all of the hair on his body seems to stand at attention, and he notices that Ilya takes at least 6 photos in that moment and is hyper aware of Ilya's hand sliding down his back. Shane almost loses it, and that's why he bolts into the bathroom immediately after they get off the stage. In the book, Shane purposefully leaves the door unlocked to the bathroom because he knows that Ilya will be following him in there, and he describes his feelings at that moment as seething. In the book version, Ilya walks in and immediately crowds Shane. There's no space between them when they first get into that bathroom. That's a difference between the two because in the show, they purposefully keep distance between Shane and Ilya here to kind of build more tension between them. So this feeling here is both a combination of frustration, anger, but also overwhelm because he is still so affected by Ilya and he knows that it's clouding his judgment in more ways than one. I think the show is actually stronger here for all of the long pauses and lingering looks that they build up. I've slowed this video down so you can really notice the facial expressions here, but also how long it is between the first words spoken between them. And Ilya goes right back into his stereotypical kind of joking demeanor, which further irritates Shane because Shane wants to be angry. He wants to be dignified in his anger. And so when he finally yells back at Ilya, you can see on Ilya's face that he's surprised by this. And initially, I think he thinks Shane's just being his typical self, but you can slowly see Ilya's face drop when he realizes that Shane means it and that his anger is real. In the book, Ilya's, again, already standing very close to Shane during all of this back and forth, and he's tracing a finger over Shane's jaw, so it's kind of already shifting Shane's demeanor because of the proximity. I think because they're separated in this scene in the show, it kind of helps for us to differentiate and really identify Shane's anger here without Ilya kind of taking over the control and the mood of the room. And it isn't until Ilya pushes himself off the wall and actually approaches Shane that things start to shift. I also think that there's a really beautiful choice here with the music. There's a simple piano note, and that's when kind of the air in the room changes and we're cued by the music as well. In this moment, Shane really wants to tell Ilya to go screw, but instead, to his mortification, he hears himself say please. And that is really kind of a defeatist moment for Shane. In the book, Shane's describing this as feeling dizzy, overwhelmed, but also absurdly impressed by how good Ilya's English suddenly is, because Shane notices everything when it comes to Ilya. And so even though he's trying to maintain his more stoic, demeanor here, he kind of melts into Ilya. And that's something that Hudson Williams also described that he was channeling in this scene. I think that Hudson Williams' ability to communicate with his eyes and almost convince us of the desperation he's feeling here, it was so impressive the first time I watched it. And every time I review the scene, this lean in that he does with his forehead really brings that message home. He is a puddle when it comes to Ilya, and he knows that. He's very much identified that Ilya is his weakness by this point. He doesn't have a backbone when it comes to Ilya yet, and his desire outweighs his pride because he wants connection and he wants closeness and he wants something more real. We see in this scene that he kind of relinquishes control again to Ilya, and Ilya tells him what's going to happen. We're going to go back out there, and then afterwards, maybe if you're lucky, I'll invite you up to my room and we'll just continue on business as usual with one another. In the book, Shane says, "You're really going to leave me like this?" And that's another line that they removed, but it does kind of show that the physical element of their relationship kind of runs the gambit right now. In the show, they choose to focus on the previous point I made, which is that Shane notices everything when it comes to Ilya, and that's because he would rather be close to him and know him better as a person than just continue on with the physical relationship that they've established with one another. So anytime he gets even a little glimpse of who Ilya is behind the facade that he puts up, I think Shane falls deeper and deeper in love with him and loses more and more of his control of the situation. The line, "Wow, genetic," is not included in the book, nor is a lot of the, implied lingering moments between them. I think that this is all absolutely brilliant. The only thing said in the book is Shane felt dizzy and angry and kind of impressed by Rosanov's English. It had really come a long way. So I think the show taking the liberty to add this line and this moment between them that is kind of the bridge between their physical relationship and a deeper one that Shane really wants to have is important. And when we do focus on Ilya's POV, that comes up again. This kiss, I think, is more significant when you are going over this scene in Ilya's POV. In Shane's POV, he notes that Ilya was getting ready to leave the bathroom, had his hand on the door handle, when he quickly turned and grabbed the front of Shane's jacket and kissed him roughly, then let him go and says, "Good luck tonight," and then he was gone. I think the show does a much better job with this scene conveying the deeper emotions these two characters already are starting to feel for one another at this point, and how they still don't know how to communicate them properly. The Vegas hotel room scene has a really tragic irony hidden within it because Shane and Ilya live the same night at very different emotional speeds. Each man is closest to the truth that the other one is hiding. What I mean by that is that neither of them fully know how to articulate their feelings to themselves. They don't understand themselves yet. So in this scene, Ilya already knows what this could be between he and Shane, and it terrifies him, whereas Shane doesn't know what this is until the night is already over and he's in the elevator. Ilya's hidden truth is that he wants more than control. He wants intimacy. He wants tenderness. He wants Shane to stay. But inside, Ilya tells himself that this is just a hookup, that being in control means that he's safe, that the thing between him and Shane has to end because it can never be a long-term thing. Ilya won't admit that to himself yet, but Shane can already sense it because Shane has picked up on the fact that over the course of the years that the two of them have been hooking up, Ilya is a very attentive person, which is why when he's not that way in this interaction, Shane feels the absence of it once it's over. Ilya spends this entire interaction trying to avoid touching Shane, and Shane picks up pretty quickly that Ilya is losing his resolve and composure in moments that should be effortless for him. The problem with that is that even though Shane feels the cracks in Ilya's resolve, he doesn't yet understand what those cracks mean. Shane's hidden truth is that this is not just sex for him, and it never has been. For context, this scene takes place in June of 2014. Shane does not accept that he is gay until episode 5, which is when Shane is 25 years old in June of 2017. He is avoiding his own feelings. He is avoiding admitting that he might be gay, and instead he tells himself a simpler story, which is that this is purely physical, it's about power and release, and that their interactions will end the way they always do, which is him feeling ashamed and wishing things were different. But Shane keeps coming back. Shane is willing to sacrifice his own internal peace for these small pieces of Ilya that he's allowed to have, even if he frames that desire as humiliation instead of admitting that it's actually a longing for closeness. Ilya feels that before Shane ever does. Ilya sees Shane's eagerness to please him as too close to emotional. When Shane starts to beg, it doesn't feel like role play to Ilya, it feels personal. And so when Ilya feels the weight of Shane's need for attention, his willingness to please, Ilya knows that it's more than lust. He recognizes that it's attachment. He recognizes that it's wanting more than what he's going to be able to provide him, and that is what unsettles him, because Ilya registers and realizes that Shane is emotionally invested before Shane can even admit that to himself. And that knowledge scares him. The reason they can't be together right now is because they're not emotionally aligned. Ilya feels an emotional pull towards Shane that he doesn't understand, and he panics. Shane feels the weight of regret and tries to minimize it. Ilya shuts things down between them to avoid wanting more, and Shane is willing to accept his own shame as inevitable because he doesn't even consider that how he feels about Ilya isn't shameful. His shame is his own internalized homophobia. And that is the tragic irony, because if either of them had access to their own truths at the same time that they were able to sense the others, this night would have gone completely different. And instead we see Ilya removing the possibility of hope because wanting Shane hurts too much, and he never in his life has felt like he can be happy, which is compounded by Ilya's complications with his family and being from Russia and everything going on in Russia. Shane transversely removes the possibility of having any emotional depth because it feels too complicated for him. And so at the heart of this entire interaction is two people that actually really like each other and want to be closer emotionally and have intimacy in a different way, but they don't know how to articulate it. Each of them carries the awareness that the other one lacks, which is why it's very poetic, but also pivotal, so that by the time we reach the end of their story in the season finale, the payoff feels real and feels earned. Obviously, when you're taking a book and turning it into a screen adaptation, these emotions are very difficult to express with dialogue. Much of it is done with physical acting and implied feeling. And I think even though this scene has a lot more going on beneath the surface than you might realize if you hadn't read the source material, both Hudson and Connor do an incredible job showcasing how broken this interaction leaves both of them, which is why when they finally admit that they love each other in the season finale, it feels like a dam breaking, because the two of them have been carrying the weight of this for years, and they can finally relieve themselves of this really painful tension.